So you have the time horizon to invest that money and earn. The stock market over the last 20 years on averages 10% a year. So that's triple what most lower rate mortgages are. You're going to be able to pay
Yeah.
your house off in 18 years instead of 24 if you just did that. And you have liquidity on the side. So in your case, if you did want to buy a property somewhere else, now you've got this extra cash available.
Hi, this is Garrett Sutton, and you're listening to the Average Joe Finances Podcast.
If you're watching this on YouTube, make sure you smash the like and subscribe buttons. If you're listening to our podcast, go leave us a 5-star review. All of our links can be found in the video description or show notes below. Hey, welcome back to the Average Joe Finances Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Cavagioni, and I'm joined today by our guest, Derek Mazzarella. Derek, thank you so much for joining me. I'm sorry that our co-host couldn't be here today. She had some other things going on, so it's just you and me. But I think this is going to be great.
Looking forward to it, Mike. Thanks for having me on.
Awesome. Hey, so real quick, I want to start this off the same way I start every podcast episode, and my audience would like to know more about you. So if you could share a little bit about yourself, tell us your story, and just tell us who is Derek Mazzarella.
Sure. Okay. I'll give you the really long version, like the 6-hour version I think you want, right?
Sure. Down from there. 10-hour episode.
Sure. Yeah, I'll be quick. So basically, I went to Bryant University in Little Rhode Island here. I went to a business school. My first job out of college was actually with Aflac. Everyone knows the duck, the Gilbert Gottfried thing. So I did that for a year and a half. I was selling supplemental insurance. Plus, I graduated in 2007, so 2008 hits. And since we sell mostly through companies, I lost about a third of my book of clients. So now here I am making little money anyway, and then I lose what little money I was pulling in. So through networking, I met a financial advisor. He decided to, hire me, and I've been a financial advisor since 2009. I've bounced around to 2 other firms, but I ended up here at Gateway Financial Partners in Connecticut. I really just focus on helping people make better financial decisions, get on track to retire, and help them achieve their financial priorities.
I think it's important that we have discussions like this because a lot of times when you've reached a point where you found success, so going into your background, right? You started off, you graduated in 2007, you started working for Aflac, realized that wasn't for you. Okay, so next steps, your whole thing is you want to build wealth and be able to plan your retirement and then help others do that. So if we can dig into a little bit about that, what is something that you've seen that maybe some people might not have prepared themselves for the future when they want to retire?
I'd say the biggest misconception that people have is that they just need a number. Like, I just need $1 million, 1.23 million, like whatever the number is. Yeah, there's some magic number floating around that once we all hit this number, we're going to go to a magical meadow and retirement's awesome and we all have a good thing. So I think that's a piece of it. But the other challenge that a lot of people have is I think we just underestimate a lot of pieces of retirement. For example, I read a lot of studies on retirement. The average person thinks they spend $2,000 a year in healthcare costs. In reality, they spend over $6,000. Right. So that's a pretty big gap. And then the average person doesn't think they're going to live past 80, 82 when there's a 50-50 shot that if you're married right now, you're going to live to age 90. People don't really think about market risk as much as you think they would. So there's a lot of different little factors that come into retirement that people just assume, okay, if I just make enough money, a lot of people assume once I hit that magic number, I'll be fine. And not everyone can hit that magic number with their career. But there are definitely things that we can do now that'll help you prepare for retirement later on and give you a clearer path through retirement.
Yeah, that's a great point. And you're saying some things that are really catching my attention when it comes to that life expectancy, right? So you're talking about how the average age is 82 now. And then if you're married, you could live until 90. And I feel like a lot of times when people are looking towards their future, you retire, let's say you retire at 65, you're like, okay, do I really have the next 25 years planned out? What if you live past 90, right? But most of the time, if you're just looking for that magic number, you're not really paying attention to the rest of the stuff that's going on, like inflation and things like that. That magic number is going to dwindle very fast. Like $1 million today is not going to be $1 million tomorrow. And it's not the same $1 million that it was yesterday. And I feel when I grew up, when I was young and as a child, $100,000 was like huge.
Mhm.
That $100,000 today is like having $1 million. A millionaire back when I was a kid in the 80s and 90s had a lot of money, right? A millionaire today is almost middle class, right? Actually, it is. It's upper middle class, right? If your net worth is like a million or 2 million, you're like upper middle class. That's just something that I think people really need to think about when they're planning for their retirement. So it's not so much the number, it's going to be how long will it last? How long can you sustain yourself? But going into that, what is it that you've seen? What would you say that you've seen people when they're thinking about their future? What are some of the common mistakes that you've seen? So I know we talk about they're not really thinking about the age of retirement, or they're thinking about this magic number. But what are some of the things that you've seen people make mistakes on that are just different from that?
That does. Yeah, I think I'm just trying to think because there's a few of them. For example, I think one of the biggest things we're taught now, and this has started to dwindle a little bit, especially the boomer generation, they were the first kind of experiment with a 401k. And all they were taught was put money in a 401k, put money on a pre-tax basis. And if you just do that, you'll be fine. And I think the one thing that we're realizing now, or a lot of boomers are realizing now, is that they only have one tax bucket. So they're getting a retirement and they have, let's say they did save their $1 million or whatever their healthy amount is, all of that is going to be taxable. So they don't have $1 million. They have a million minus their tax bracket. And then when they reach a certain age, they're going to start to have to take money out, even if they don't need it. So their tax bracket is going to potentially go up. And things happen in retirement all the time, just like they do in life. You may need a new roof. You may need a new car. You're going to need some health care. So what happens is now you're taking all that money out and all that money's taxable. Now that $50,000 roof becomes a $70,000 because of taxes. So all of that stuff
Yeah.
compounds. And because we're not really thinking of diversifying from a tax standpoint, that's probably one of the biggest issues I've seen for retirees.
Sure. No, that's a great point, Derek. Not only having to pay the taxes, but also thinking about inflation in the future as well, right? So that what you think you're spending 50,000 of today's dollars on, in the future you're spending like 90,000, right? Because of the taxes and then inflation. I mean, you're talking about, if you're saving right now, you're in your 20s and you're saving to retire at 65, right? That money you're saving now is not the same as it is in the future, which is why it's important to invest it and beat inflation. But at the same time, if you're just going off this magic number, you're going to wind up getting stuck. All right, Derek, life happens, expenses happen, like you were talking about, right? You have a roof could go out, you can have your water heater blow up, and all these things that happen. So, what are some ways to mitigate some of that risk if you've got yourself to the point where you're on track to reach your magic number, right?
I think the big thing is you have to plan for it. So when I do plans for folks, I build those things in there and said, okay, you're going to retire for 25 years. You're probably going to want 2, 3 cars. Put it in the plan. One thing we all experienced during COVID was we're stuck in our house. Retirees are not, they're stuck like to say we were in COVID, but they're looking around and they're thinking, oh, I could redo that kitchen. Like every retiree that I work with within the first 5 years, almost all of them want to either move or redo some major project in their home. So you've got to build that in the project. So now your magic number starts creeping up. And to your
Sure.
point with inflation, if you think about it, if inflation is just 3%, which is a little bit higher than it has been the last 20 years, but not out of the ordinary when you look historically, your money's gonna be worth half in 18 years. That's the course of retirement. So if you think you start with a million, by the end of retirement, your amount is, without spending any of it, is worth half. So now you got to throw in all this spending with it too. So you really got to balance out making sure you put enough money at risk, essentially. So put money in the stock market and like real estate, like you talk about in your podcast all the time. I think it's a great asset class to own because you can generate income from it. It is an inflation hedge. So there's all these different things you can do to help mitigate the risk of inflation. This is all I have. I have no more money coming in. My mindset is totally gone from adding money for the last 40 plus years to now I've got to spend this money. And when you have a finite amount of things, people just inherently hold on to it. So they either don't spend enough and don't enjoy retirement, or they invest so conservatively, they have all this cash that inflation just erodes their wealth over time. And then 15 years into retirement, why am I eating only tuna fish?
Yeah. And ramen noodles, right? Like
Back
you're
in
back in the
college.
college days or something.
Yeah.
No, Derek, that's great points. Diving a little bit deeper into that, because you brought up one of the things that I love, real estate, right? But it sounds like you, as you're helping build out these plans, you're helping your clients have really diverse portfolios, right? It doesn't just have to be your 401k. It doesn't just have to be stocks and companies that you believe in or index funds or ETFs, right? There's other things. There's real estate. There's things you get into that generate cash flow, right? Because ultimately, when you retire, that's what you want, right? You want to have a steady income coming in that supports your retired lifestyle without having to go to work. So that's why, me personally, I'm a fan of real estate. I feel you can really build that up to the point where if you have enough, you're going to get that money coming in. But again, if you're managing it all yourself, you're not really retired. Now it's just become a second job, right? So you got to
Mhm.
get yourself to the point where you have enough where you can hire somebody to manage it for you and then still generate enough income and still be able to pay the expenses. Things are going to break there too. So those unexpected expenses are going to come up as well. I really feel like that is one of the biggest points or takeaways that people need to keep in their mind is there's always going to be expenses in the future, right? You don't have to have that arbitrary $1 million that this
Right.
is what needs to be my account. You can say, this is how much I want to bring in per month, and then add the inflation to that. So am I going to be able to increase my monthly amount by 3% every year to match inflation? And those are some of the things that we should be thinking about. But what are some of the things that you think people hear, or is just a very common thing you hear people in the finance world talking about that is not the best advice or something that we should rethink about?
I think when it comes to retirement, one of the things I've learned through this process is, have you heard of the 4% rule? So
Yep.
for the folks that don't know, basically they say, okay, take that number and then your asset number, let's say it's $1 million again, just for easy math. Basically $1 million times 4%, that means you can get $40,000 a year of income and then index that with inflation. And if you do 4% of your assets, then you can basically spend, and that money will last you for basically a 30-year retirement. And what I found is typically that was good. It was done in the 90s. But generally, people leave actually a lot of money on the table because more often than not, the market's going to be up. If you're just doing 4%, you're just doing the minimum, you're going to actually have a lot of excess money left over. The better way to do is a more dynamic spending strategy where actually you take more off the table when the markets go up. So you can actually increase your spending over time. And if the market really tanks, then you just spend a little bit less that month. So you have kind of a more of a dynamic withdrawal strategy. And that'll actually allow you to have as safe as an investment process, but it'll also allow you to enjoy more of your retirement. Because at the end of the day, it's all about you work your whole life to get to this point. You may as well enjoy it and may not be freaked out and say, oh, I can only spend 4% of my assets. I can only do that. And I have to be locked in this thing for the next 30 years. You can be dynamic and actually spend more money when the market does go up. You
Yeah,
just
for
have to have
sure.
that plan in place for it.
No, that's a great point. So having a good withdrawal strategy, that's something I wrote down as you were going. Now, we're talking right now about retiring at the standard retirement age of 65. Do you talk about that at all with anybody?
The earliest retirees I typically have around the 50s. I don't think I've had anyone that retired at 35, for example. But generally, the people that retire at 50, even that's still 15 plus years earlier than quote unquote normal. So yeah, I do work with that. There's definitely more challenge. You have to think about how to make the money last more. You definitely have to save more because now your retirement's going from 30 years to 45. Other challenges now you've got this kind of healthcare costs for the next 15 years. It tends to be pretty expensive. You got to quantify for. But yeah, generally it just involves having a lot of different assets. The other thing we talked about earlier in the show was the 401k piece of it. The one part challenge with the 401k is you're retiring before that 59 and a half. You really can't take money out of there without penalties. There's some kind of unique rules you can do it, but don't want to get too technical with those now. So you have to have different levers you can pull in terms of assets that you can build from. And once again, it's all about income generating assets. Mike, it's not about just having a number. It's like, what income
Yeah,
are we going
no,
to generate from the assets you have?
that's absolutely right. So there are situations where you might be able to. During COVID, there was that, I think it was up until December of 2020, you were able to pull out a certain amount of money without paying the penalties. I know I did. I pulled some money out to invest in more real estate. That was just something I wanted to do during that time because I didn't have to worry about paying the penalties. Although I did over the next couple of years have to pay taxes on that money that I pulled out, which is okay. But yeah, so that's good. So you've had people like in their 50s, but let me ask you what your thoughts are, though, Derek, on people that do try to retire in their 30s or early 40s. What do you think about stuff like that? Like, what's your opinion on the FIRE
Yeah.
movement?
I'm totally for whatever people want to do.
You're with
Like,
it.
to be honest with you, yeah, if that actually fulfills you, because my practice is a lot about, all right, so you're going to retire. What are we going to do with yourself? For some people, their job is a part of them, and that's totally fine. But if for a lot of people it's not, I think my only gripe with the fire movement or concern, if you're trying to just save and you're not doing the things like investing in real estate or having side hustles that generate a lot of passive income without you putting a lot of work into it, if you're that person that just does nothing and just saves and doesn't live your life for 15 years from 20 to 35 or 40 even, what are we doing here? Your 20s are great.
Sure.
If you have to give up, I'd rather work an extra 5 years and have an awesome time in my 20s. Maybe I'm crazy for saying that, but that's just more how I feel. So it depends on the type of fire they're doing. Because I've heard of some people that they just like stuff their 401k, all they do is save, and they're not creating other income producing assets or any passive income. And they're just saving and scrimping by and doing nothing for 15 years. I just I don't understand the point of giving up your 20s and 30s to have a better time in your 50s.
No, I like that. I like that because I've seen a lot of this in the past, just even with my own habits. When I first got into personal finances myself, it was to get myself out of debt, right? It was to start getting myself and my family to a good point to where we can be more comfortable. But the process in getting there was like a 2-year process of really being frugal and keeping everything so tight. It does become a little bit overbearing. So there was little things that we did where when we paid a credit card off, we would go out to dinner and celebrate, just do something with the family. Then we got to the point where we were comfortable enough to put money into a separate account that we called that our fun money account, like family fun money, which is something we still do to this day, right? So I have a whole bunch of different accounts. Sinking funds is what I do, right? And every
Love it.
time I get paid, my money goes into all these different accounts. And it also goes into my HELOC, right? Because I do velocity banking as well. But these separate accounts is like we have a travel account, we have a family fun account, and then we have a grocery budget as well, like a grocery account. Like
Yeah.
literally we buy all of our groceries out of that account. But we do it that way so that way we can still focus on where our money is going and then not have to worry so much about if we're going to go out and go do things. Like we have that money set to the side.
Love every saying. And this is something I
Yeah.
teach all my clients. I'm a big fan of
Well,
bucketing
good.
money. I would do reverse budgeting with a lot of clients where a lot of people are like, all right, let's do your budget. And then, all right, cut this. And then, okay, this is how you save. Because most people get their paycheck, they spend stuff, then they save. I think we need to do the opposite. And I think you're probably doing this too. It sounds is I have one account, one purpose, and you have the money automatically going places. Because one of the things I always hear from clients is I feel so guilty about spending money. I don't know if you've ever felt that way.
I don't feel guilty anymore.
Good. Yeah. And I'm sure it's because, all right, the money's going for these places for these reasons, and I'm
Yep.
free to spend this. And I think a lot of people feel guilty because they think, oh, am I not saving enough? We basically create, all right, what are all your priorities? Is it going on vacation every year? Okay, it's going to be 5,000 for that. Boom, let's make sure we're saving that per year. And then everything we have set up. So your retirement's covered, your fun stuff covered, your short midterm goals are covered. And you really just want to automate all that stuff. So if your listeners are hearing or nodding their heads while they're listening to this, I'd say set up a reverse budget and just have money going ACH or direct deposit. Your employer will most likely can send money to different banks.
Yeah. So that's actually one of the things that I was in the military, right? So I get direct deposit and I had it set up so that it would split to these different accounts. Like I set up these allotments to go to these different accounts. So I retired at 38 and took like a gap year off where I was just asked and going to real estate meetups and looking for new investment opportunities. And during that gap year, I was keeping myself extremely busy, but I got super bored. I put myself into this routine where it was just like, okay, same thing over and over again. So I was like, okay, I'm bored now. I got to do something. So I went back to work. So I found a job with the Navy now as a civilian, doing a lot of the things that I did while I was in. And it restarted that sense of purpose for me. I thought that was awesome. And now I'm at a point where if I want to walk away, I can walk away. If it really gets to be too much and I don't want to do it anymore, I could just do that. But I had to work really hard to get myself to that point to where I could say, hey, I'm just going to walk away. Right. But part of that was being smart about my finances, being smart about getting rid of the bad debt. And then when I decided to invest and take on debt, leveraging it properly to make it less burdensome and more of an asset. I use my debt as an asset. There's stuff I get to write off on my taxes because of mortgage payments, certain things, certain taxes I get to write off because I pay these property taxes, certain things I get to write off because improvements done on the properties. So things like that have been absolutely awesome in helping set me up to where I am today. really hardcore one way or really hardcore the other way. Do you see that a lot? Because I feel you'll have, here's a good comparison, right? You have the Dave Ramseys of the world, and then you have the Robert Kiyosaki's of the world. I tend to take both of that and I'm like right here in the middle. If this was a political thing, you could say I'm an independent, right? I am right there in the middle. I'm a centrist, and I take a little bit from here, a little bit from here, and I put it together. Have you seen extremes like that? Or do you see like a lot of people in the middle? What are some of the clients that you've seen?
I definitely seen extremes. I've seen the extreme the other way where people just spend and don't do a damn thing towards retirement.
Sure.
Yeah, but I think you have a great point.
Well, I want to compare those two. You know, you got the
I
Dave
don't know.
Ramseys, you got the Robert Kiyosaki's, and then you got
partiers at the
the person that works.
Yeah, basically, they've reached 50. But yeah, I think it's pretty common. I think a lot of people are a little on the fence. I think a lot of people still shy away from owning real estate directly because they think they're getting that plumber call or the tenant call at 3 a.m. about the toilets, which I have a rental property. I've never gotten a call of that at that time of day. But yeah, I think in general, either way, it's too restrictive either way, or it's too much. Because on the one hand, let's say you go all in on real estate, that's the only thing you ever have. You do have a lot of cash flow, but then you have some liquidity issues, right? You can't just sell a house in a week as much as you like to. Maybe you could, unless you had some weird wholesaler job. And then the other side of the coin is if all you're doing is just saving or just spending down money and just worrying about your debt, you're never building wealth. I see that being an issue too. One of my biggest pet peeves is especially when clients have a really low interest rate on their personal home when they aggressively pay down the mortgage. Because to our conversation earlier, it's not about having the assets, it's about the income that's going to generate. In the house that you live in,
Right.
even if you don't have a mortgage on it, it's not generating any income for you. It's still an expense.
Yes.
So I think you're on point there, Mike. You've got to have balance. You don't want to have bad debt. To me, debt is like fire. If you buy a ton of stuff that you don't need and you build up all this bad debt and this credit card debt, it's going to burn you. But if you use it wisely and you leverage it for real estate and you have people paying you a higher interest than what you're paying, so which one are you going to have it do for you?
Yeah, no, Derek, I love that because I feel like with these two extremes, people, they don't get to enjoy life, right? They'll focus so hard on one of these areas, and that's where their sole focus was. I found myself in that situation, right? I found myself being so focused on, I got to figure out different ways to generate more income. I need to have so many streams of income. And it started getting crazy. And I realized I was burning myself out. Actually, I took almost 5 or 6 months off from the podcast, but I had so much content pre-recorded that from an outsider looking in, it'll look like I only took a month off. But yeah, you got to focus on taking care of yourself as well. I feel like a lot of times, especially people in the personal finance or real estate or just entrepreneurs in general, tend to burn ourselves out because we get so hell-bent on more. And I feel like you have to find that happy medium. So I really appreciate your point of view there because it can be very difficult for someone to focus on being able to retire and then actually enjoy life up until that point. What's the point, like you said, of retiring in your 50s and being able to fully enjoy your time in your 50s if the first 50 years of your life was just this grind and killing yourself to get there? How much longer are you going to last when you retire? When you beat yourself up that entire time, that stress adds up and it takes years away from your life. What do you think about that?
I totally agree with you. And I think if all you do is are working, then that's going to be who you are. And that's once you retire, you're not going to know what to do with yourself because all you've done is work. And that's your whole life. I had a client, he's going to retire this year. I'm like, that's awesome. What are you going to do with yourself? What do you mean? I was like, are you kidding me? What are you going to do that's going to make you happy? That's going to give your life purpose after you quit your job? He called me like 2 weeks later. Said, I'm going to keep working for another year. I'm like, okay, we'll take some time to figure that out. He said, your question really shook me. And to me, that seems like a really average question. I'm sure some people are probably laughing just even listening to this. But there are people that just put their heads down and all they do is work and that's their identity. So I really would encourage you to say, okay, what's going to give me purpose in life? And also there's a concept of enough. Like what's going to be enough for you? Whether that's enough working, enough money, enough whatever. I would just really encourage you to think about it. Do you need 400 properties or are you cool with 350? Like what's enough for
You don't even need that much.
Yeah.
You could be set for life with 10 properties, honestly, if you just really focus down. I like one of the things you were talking about earlier too, with the having the lower interest rate, like not focusing on paying down that property so fast. Like my home, I was fortunate during COVID, I was able to refinance and get it down to 2.25%, right? I don't want to pay this house off early. Now I am paying down a little bit more because I want the liquidity with my HELOC. So if a good deal comes along or something comes along that I want to invest in, I can just pull that money out and do that. But I definitely do not want to pay the house off in 10 years. Maybe I'll pay it off in 20 years, not 10, but I feel with such a low interest rate, it's almost like a free loan that I got on this property.
Even if you want to be totally conservative, let's say like you are that person, because I have this conversation with clients all the time. Like they've always been taught you got to pay off the house as soon as possible. And for other people, it's just, I can't have debt because it just feels restrictive, or I don't want to owe anyone anything. I want it to be all mine. And I'm like, okay, let's say you do want to do that. Why don't we set up another investment account for you on this side? Instead of taking that extra $500 or $1,000 a month you're throwing towards a mortgage, let's throw it in there. Even if you want to be super conservative now, like now, right now, money market's paying 5% and your mortgage is 2 or 3, that's a 2% delta we have right there. So we can pay down your mortgage faster, getting a higher interest rate. And most mortgages are 30 years. And if you pay them down aggressively, you're paying them down to what, 20 years, maybe 24, 25. So you're really only shaving 4 or 5 years off for the most part. So you have the time horizon to invest that money and earn. The stock market over the last 20 years on averages 10% a year. So that's triple what most lower rate mortgages are. You're going to be able to pay your house off in 18 years instead of 24 if you just did that. And you have liquidity on the side. So in your case, if you did want to buy a property somewhere else, now you've got this extra cash available. I mean, there's a more efficient way of saving it towards a house, and it's going to be more liquid for you.
No, I like that because if I'm paying 2.25% on my house, but instead of paying like an extra mortgage payment, I'm taking that extra mortgage payment and I'm putting it into an ETF or an index fund that's averaging between 8 and 12%. That delta there is huge. And honestly, it can get to the point where in a couple of years after investing that money, instead of putting it into the house, I could just say, okay, I've got to the point where I can now take this money and pay off the rest of the balance on my home much faster. There's other strategies. Like I use my HELOC and stuff for it. And I know other people that do this and they pay their home off in 5 to 7 years. But I feel like a strategy like that is great if you have a higher interest rate. If you have a low interest rate, it's really hard for me to justify paying off my house early, just for me personally. But Derek, I want to ask you, so there's been a lot of things that changed, right? You got into this game, you graduated in 2007, you started working for Aflac, then 2008 happened. So like right out the gate, you got to experience a financial crisis, right? From that time to where we are now and now experiencing what happened with COVID, what are some of the things that you've seen change with people with their personal finances or just their mentality when it comes to their money?
Oh man, there's so many things, Mike. Because I think one of the biggest change, especially for my industry, I think we've gone from being mainly investment advisors to more kind of comprehensive advisors. At least the good ones have, because there's just so much more than the market to talk about when it comes to your finances. So I think that's been probably the biggest shift. And I think the next biggest shift is going to be more talking to the human person about getting fulfilled and making them reach their goals and all that stuff. But from the investor standpoint, I think there's just so much more information out there and people are so much more well-versed in this. They're still doing the same things where they overreact to a down market. But I think we're definitely doing more low-cost index investings. People aren't trying to time the market as much as I've seen in the past. I think mainly people get it when you say, hey, look, the market's down. We got to ride this out. We're not going to overreact to it. I've learned that, hey, look, this is an opportunity. It's either an opportunity because everything's on sale. And I think people need to have that mentality again. The other options are, hey, look, this is a great Roth conversion opportunity. If your income's kind of maybe down a little bit, but the market's down, let's say at a balance from 100,000, now it's down to 80, you can convert that at 80 because any advisor is going to tell you, hey, you're going to stay in the market anyway, wait for the market to rebound. Now we convert that. You pay taxes today on it, which sucks, but now that rebound is tax-free. So there's all these opportunities, and there's opportunities to do tax loss harvesting. So I think there's a lot of educating we've been doing for a lot of folks where we realize, okay, these down markets are great. And quite frankly, if I'm a young advisor or a young person that's out there investing now, I want the market to stay flat for years because you're just adding money in as the market's low because you really want the market to just scoot up when you retire or right before you retire.
Yeah. No,
I mean, that's the ideal scenario. Everyone's, I want the market to keep going up, but like it's getting expensive. So just have it stay down for a while. Who cares?
No, I love that. When stuff like that does happen, you got to look at it as now things are on sale. Now's the time to get in, right? Keep what you've already got in there, but now's the time to get in. And you talked about you had that 20% drop. So you go from 100,000 to 80,000. Now, when you do that conversion, you are paying less taxes because you're paying taxes on that 80,000 instead of the 100,000. Then, of course, the loss that you get to write off as well. So maybe pay a little bit less in taxes. That's pretty significant. Okay. So Derek, you've got to experience a lot of I guess you could say the ups and downs of the market. And I appreciate how you share. Basically, we need to hold fast when we hit a down market. But with that being said, I would like to transition this into the final round. It's where I'm going to ask you the same four questions I ask everybody that comes on this show. And these particular questions will actually play very well into that last thing we just talked about. So I get to get a good idea, and my audience gets to get a good idea of how you are under a little bit of pressure. So if you're ready to
Okay,
go,
let's do it.
okay, let's do it. All right. So Derek, the first question I have for you of the final round is, what's the biggest mistake that you have ever made when it comes to your finances or your business life?
All right. I don't think I made it like a really significant one, but I think the biggest one for me personally was in 2021. Part of my career is I did some employee benefits. I would consult for a time period with clients on their health insurance plans, and I sold part of that, and then I sold it again in 2021. I was learning about crypto then, so I'm going to dump some of this money into crypto, and
There
then
it
I looked like a
is.
genius, Mike, for 2 weeks. And then obviously we had this huge crypto crash, and now it's come back to even. But I think one of the mistakes I really made was with it's such a volatile asset, and I knew this, and I'm kicking myself still to this day, is instead of dumping that money in all at once, and I dump it in knowing, hey, if I lose this, I lose it because I know how risky it was, but I should have chunked it out over time. Because to me, that would have, hey, look, it's dropping, but I'm buying more as it's getting cheaper. So to me, that was like personally my biggest mistake, and kind of go after some of the crappier coins like Cardano and stuff like that. So I should have just stuck to Bitcoin and Ethereum. So to me, that was my biggest financial mistake that I made.
Yeah, sure. I always kick myself in the butt for not holding on Bitcoin when I bought it, because I bought it when it was a couple $1,000s, and I was just like, oh man, it jumped up to 19 and then dropped back down. I was like, I think I'm getting out while I'm a little bit up. So
Yeah,
yeah,
it's hard.
it's
It's
all good.
swings that volatile. It's hard.
I still
And you
made a
still, you
return
still
on it,
make
but
money,
still.
right?
Yeah. Okay. All right. So Derek, this next question kind of ties into that last one. And it's, what is something that you've learned that you wish you knew when you first started out? And the crazy thing is you started out right when the market crashed. So I'm really interested to what your answer will be on this one.
So this is a tough one for me because I feel like I started out, so I had everyone thinks financial advisors are rich right off the bat, but they're not. But I had no money. I wish I just even took a little bit of money and just started stuffing my Roth IRA back then. If I go back in time, I tell my 16-year-old self, hey, when you get that first job, put some money away into a Roth. I would have just maxed that out. Had I known what I know now too about the housing market, I didn't realize at the time like how much real estate was on sale at that time and how rare that is. Like that was a once in a generation, probably multi-generation opportunity to buy real estate. I was making no money,
Yeah.
so I probably wouldn't have qualified for a loan. But to me, I think my biggest mistake was really just not being a little bit more diligent early on. I was just like crazy about investing back in my business over and over again instead of just peeling some of it off over time. When I was 24 years old, when I started in this business, I would have had a lot more in my Roth IRA now if I started doing that.
Look, for context there, I bought my first home in 2007. So you could guess how
Oh,
that went. But
yeah.
all right, this next question again ties into that last one. And I'm pretty sure because over the years you've learned quite a bit with a lot of the ups and downs in the markets. Do you have any tips or tricks that you would recommend to a young person that might be getting started today?
I'd say the first thing I would do, as mentioned earlier, is start automating your savings and saving in different buckets. You want to have a pre-tax bucket, have the Roth bucket, and then have an investment account because you're going to want the flexibility and interchangeability of all three of those things. So diversify your savings and just automate. That would be my biggest thing ever. Just get it out of your mind. Just start saving automatically. Ideally, you want to be saving 10 to 15, maybe even 20% of your income. If you could save three, you could save five, just start and just snowball it up from there.
Set it and forget it.
Don't think about because think about you get your paycheck and you get all these items deducted from taxes to Social Security to healthcare. Just add one more line item on there and just make that for you. Don't pay the government, pay yourself.
Yeah. No, that's great. The way that I have my stuff set up now with all my allotments that go to these different buckets on top of what I put away in my, so I have a thrift savings plan, right? Similar to a 401k, but on top of what I put into that, my entire paycheck, I only see maybe 30% of it before it actually hits my bank. Everything else gets distributed elsewhere. That 30% is, this is what I have left to pay bills and everything else, but I pay myself first. I feel like that is so important.
Absolutely.
You ever heard of the profit first method?
I have, yeah. So
So
yeah, I love that. Yeah.
I read that book. I've interviewed people about it, and that has always been something that in the back of my head is something I'm thinking about every time I get paid. Okay, let me take my cut first, and
Mhm.
then it's okay. Now what's left to pay the bills and everything else? So
Right.
No, I love
Yeah,
that.
because it's very easy to, I don't know if you heard of Parkinson's law, but your bank account's going to fill whatever room it is. So if you make more money, you just say, oh, maybe I'll get a nicer car. Maybe I'll get a bigger house. Maybe I'll get XYZ.
Exactly. More money
So,
problems, a very common saying.
yeah.
All right, Derek, the final question of the final round is, do you have a favorite business, investing, or real estate related book or podcast or both?
Yeah, one of my favorite books that I've read recently was Buy Back Your Time by Dan Martell. And he talks all about breaking out the things that you do that you're really good at that are the most valuable and really leaning into those things. I was like, oh man, I'm doing these that I could probably still hire someone else to do that would be just as good, or hopefully maybe slightly worse if I'm giving myself a pat on the back here, but that I could
Sure.
definitely have someone else do and still have pretty similar results. And then just so I can focus more of my time on the highest, most best value and the things that I quite frankly enjoy doing the most. I think that was a good mindset shift for me in my business here and saying, okay, how do I really design this to work best for me and be most productive?
No, I love it. So great recommendation. I have not read that one yet. I'm definitely going to add it to my list. So Buy Back Your Time, Dan Martell. So definitely going to check that one out. Okay, so that is it for the final round. I do have another question I want to ask you, but before I do that, I just want to say, because I can't stop looking at it. I love your background.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it took me a while to find this thing.
I see a lot of great bands on there and artists.
Yeah.
Okay, that was the final round, but I do have another question I want to ask you that is the most important question of this entire interview, right? There are people that are listening to this episode and saying, I really appreciate what he's sharing here, and I want to learn more about him and what he does, or maybe have a chat with him sometime. So is there a website you could share with us or any social media profiles that we could follow where people could find more information about you?
Yeah, so I actually wrote a book called Just Retire Already. The website I have is called Just Retire Already. It has a little bit of bio about the book, but basically I go through all the market risks, all the different types of risks you have in retirement and how to solve them, but I do it in a more conversational, funny way with analogies and jokes. So if you want to learn a little bit more about me and how I typically work with clients, that's a good starter. The website will give a little intro. And I'm very active on LinkedIn. So if you want to follow me, LinkedIn, Derek Mazzarella, I'm posting 5 times a week. I'm always trying to educate, and once again, I try and throw some more jokes and lighthearted stuff because I know a lot of finance can be a little stodgy sometimes. Try and inject some humor in a kind of otherwise somewhat boring subject for most people.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So Derek, I got to say, yeah, this whole podcast interview, you didn't bring up a book once. So I'm going to tell my listeners here, just based off this conversation I had with Derek, I know his book's going to be great. Go check it out. I'm going to make sure we have all those links in the show notes to make it easy for everybody to go follow his profiles or go check out the book. So if you're listening right now, it's going to be in the show notes. Just copy and paste or click away. Just as I always say, please don't do it if you're driving right now. Do you have any final thoughts for our listeners, or do you want to dive a little bit deeper into giving us more of a description of your book?
Sure, I guess I can give a description of the book. The book starts out a little bit about how all these different risks we have in retirement, like kind of things we mentioned a little earlier in the podcast about inflation. How does that impact retirement? How does market risk? There's a pretty unknown risk that most people don't think about called sequence returns risk, where if the market drops the first 3 to 5 years of retirement, it could really impact your retirement. How to spend money down, Social Security spending strategies. But basically, there's all these different ways and tools you can use to maximize Social Security. So that's in the book. But like I said, everything has an analogy. Every chapter has one. There's a ton of lame jokes that I have in there. So if you love lame jokes, just a real easy read.
Dad joke guy.
My friend, he bought the book and his wife's texting me and he's giggling like out loud. So if you can read a retirement book that makes you giggle, that's what we're looking for here. So
Awesome,
that made me happy
awesome. So I know the interview's over. I really shouldn't be asking more questions, but I have another question for you. Just talking about Social Security strategies, right? Do you think that by the time I'm in my eligibility window, another 20, 30, 40 years from now, is Social Security still going to be here? That's a question I think a lot of people are asking.
I get that question all the time, Mike. And my answer is probably. I would say more than likely it will be. Because a couple of reasons. So, the largest voting block is retirees. So they're like, what politicians say, I'm going to screw over my biggest voting block and take away the one income source they have for some people,
Sure.
right? So I think it will be there. I think it'll be different. Either there's 2 ways out of this, right? Either they raise taxes on us, which everyone wants that, right? And the other way is they're probably just going to push back either the retirement age date or the minimize some of the benefits. And they already started to do some of those things in iterations. But one of the things I was reading when I was doing research for my book was actually we were in a very similar situation in the early 80s. Most people don't feel like that, realize that, but now here we are 40 plus years later, and we still have Social Security. So I think they're going to do something, and they can, I guess they could borrow a little bit from the Medicare piece of it and through taxes that way. So I think it will be there. It'll probably look a little different, but it's just such an important bedrock for retirees that I can't imagine just going to wipe it out. You and I probably have to wait till like we're 85 to collect it. But
Fingers
we'll
crossed I can make it there. Oof.
Yeah. We'll probably be living 120 with bionic arms or something. Yeah.
Download my brain into something.
Yeah.
Live in a computer. I'll be like Ultron.
Yeah.
But anyway, no, Derek, hey, I appreciate you answering that last question, because that was something that we said we were going to talk a little bit about before we hit record. I just got lost in everything else and just had a good time chatting with you, which I really did, Derek. So this was really fun. I really appreciate you coming on the show and sharing your story, sharing what you do, sharing how you've helped your clients get into a better place financially and set themselves up for retirement. Really appreciate what you do. And again, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join me and have this conversation.
Let's do it again
Absolutely.
sometime.
Absolutely. And hey, I also want to say thank you to all of my listeners. That I just want to thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today with our special guest, Derek Mazzarella. If you liked what you heard in this episode, be sure to leave us a 5-star review and tell us what you liked about the episode with Derek today. Aloha from Hawaii, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you for making it to the end of this episode. Greatly appreciate you being here with me today on the Average Joe Finances podcast. If you haven't done so yet, make this the episode that you go leave us a 5-star rating or subscribe to our YouTube channel. The Average Joe Finances podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only. Have an outstanding day.